Everyone, thank you all for joining our NEC session on compensation events. This is going to be an incredibly exciting and useful session for anyone who's involved in infrastructure or construction. Everyone knows that the heart and backbone of contracts are compensation events, so it's critical that we all pay attention. It's quite a small group of us, so we can probably keep it informal and feel free to ask questions as we go along, but otherwise there will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end. Cool, I'll just start. So if there's a question, please just shout. I won't be able to see any hands raised or anything. So for those who don't know me, I'm a chartered project professional with the APM. I've got 15 plus years of working with NEC contracts and I'm NEC accredited. I've worked for leading consultancies such as ACOM and McDonald's, and I'm probably familiar with most NEC contract options. So hopefully we should all be very relevant and very exciting to you as we go on. This is my promise to you. By the end of this session, you will understand what are compensation events and how they work within the NEC framework. You will learn the process for identifying, notifying, and managing events. We're going to review the compensation event procedure in detail and also explore best practices for managing compensation events. So why are we talking about this? It matters because it's important to keep projects on track as much as possible to ensure contracts are fairly compensated for any changes that aren't a contractor's risk. Clients are also safeguarded against unsubstantiated claims. For those who work as a client, that is the number one fear for any client. It's to protect themselves from variations and the claims. So this isn't about manipulating the system. This is about ensuring and assessing its validity and granting it and approving it where appropriate. This will ensure financial transparency between all parties. And ultimately, a good variation process means that your project is likely to succeed. So here's a question. I'll just open up to the floor. Has anyone ever had a project go exactly as planned? No changes, or anything like that. Everything the scope was perfect, and ultimately it was just delivered. If there were any changes, how were they handled? Okay, so it seems that we got we, that there's a few people here, but that's okay. So the point of this question is that to highlight that projects never go as planned. There will always be variations or changes, and what that tells us is that rather than preventing against it, we should be proactive and understand how to address the process better. Anything else? You had your hand up?
Yeah. Uh, Hi. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum
Actually,
salam.
for any project, when there is a changes, so there is a that there is a two things which we need to understand. Either this change or originated from employer, or this change originated from contractor. So if it is originated from employer, then what we need to do, there is a change order form as per clause 39 of FIDIC contract, which have a whole procedure which we need to follow. And after the approval of that thing, then we incorporate the change in the project.
Thank you for raising that. That's a very good point. I'm unfamiliar with the FIDIC contracts, I must admit, but I do hear that they have a robust variation process. We will cover that shortly. But I think what you're really referring to here is that there's a process which is essential on how change is managed. But throughout this process, we're going to explore how NEC manages change. It will be interesting to draw parallels on how the FIDIC contract is as well. So please do share your insights as we go along. So thank you for bringing that up. So, what is a compensation event? At its core, a compensation event is something that is the client's risk. Um, for um, for a contractor to claim a change, they need to demonstrate on how it's a client risk in the contract. You do sometimes get claims that aren't quite robust. To put it politely, you may get something, oh, this design is wrong, oh, I'm a bit late there, my subcontractor didn't do this. But the gist of it is if you cannot find it within an NEC contract on where it specifically links to that, you cannot claim for it as a change. So compensation events will have a direct impact on your prices. If you want your total contract price to change, there needs to be an implemented compensation event. Without that, your prices do not get changed. I've worked with clients and contractors that do not quite fully grasp this concept, and they use sometimes letter of intents or agreements, verbal agreements, emails. You cannot change your contract price without an implemented compensation events. There are no ifs or buts to that. So if you want to get paid as a contractor, understand the compensation event process. Um, what the key takeaway from this slide is that unlike other contracts, if there are FIDIC experts on this call, I'm sure you'll be able to correct me where I'm wrong, but I believe the FIDIC contract uses an extension of time and variations to cost separately, whereas the NEC does it differently. If there is an implemented compensation event, the contractor gets a chance to submit a quotation, and regardless, the quotation will have a time impact and a cost impact to it. So that it uses a very holistic approach to it. So this summarizes what I've just gone through. Variations are treated as compensation events. There are no variations in an NEC contract. There are no extensions of times, no losses, expenses, delays, disruptions. There's only compensation events, and you get a compensation which may encompass these principles. What's worth noting here is that in NEC language, there's no such thing as a variation, there's no such thing as an extension of time, and there's no loss and expense. So it is important to use the correct language. So this hammers it home. The contractor gets a chance to submit a time impact and a cost impact. A client cannot say this is a compensation event. There's no time or cost impact. The child contractor can. If they can demonstrate that there is, then they do get a chance to submit a quotation for it. So it's all well and good about talking about in practice, but we like to go quite deep into it, and hopefully you know exactly what we're talking about. Earlier on in the slide, I mentioned that if you cannot find it in the contract, it's not a compensation event. There are no vague or unsubstantiated claims. The NEC does not work that way. So what we're now going to explore is the different types of compensation events within the contract itself. I'm not going to go through all of this because I got a bit carried away and I prepared a detailed slides on every single one of those, but we'll cover them a few main ones. But what is important to know is that these slides will be circulated if you do want to familiarize yourself with it. The most common example is 60.11. The project manager gives an instruction to change the scope. For instance, my scope said I want a red door. My scope or works information said that we want a red door, but you know what? I think a blue door might be better. That is a change. The project manager gives an instruction to change the scope. And then your contractor gets to submit a compensation event, which might have a cost or a time impact to it. The project manager may well also argue that there's a savings as you wouldn't have had to get me a red door and I get a blue door instead, and the cost could have been like for like. So the project manager can state assumptions, but we'll go into that in more detail. There are exceptions to this, and in my experience, not many contractors understand this. Not every instruction is a change. And sorry, not every instruction is a compensation event. As you'll see here, is that there's four exceptions to that. A change made in order to accept a defect. For instance, going back to our door example, I wanted a blue door, you gave me a red door, that is a defect. So I'm going to instruct you to give me a blue door again. That I'm not instructing a change to the scope. I'm changing the defect that has occurred. So that is not a compensation and you're not entitled to time or money for that. So, and in the NEC language, there could be two scopes per se, a contract client scope and a contractor scope. But the client scope takes priority, and if there is a issue or a defect or a problem within the contractor scope that doesn't align with the contractor, align with the client scope. For instance, the client scope said that I wanted a three-story building, and the contractor submits their design for a two-story building with 15 doors or whatever. The point is that it's not compliant with the client scope. So the project manager gives you an instruction to change your contractor's design to align with what we asked for in the first place. That is not a compensation event. So that hopefully hammers the point home. If the works information or client scope takes priority, if the instruction is to align the contractor with that, that would not be a compensation event. This is always one of my favorite ones, and I'm sure many contractors would quite like this one as well. So the client does not allow access to you and use of each part of the site by the later of its access date. You get quite often in NEC contracts that a client needs to provide access to a particular part of land or a particular area of within a building. Contractors cannot come up and say, "Oh, okay, we want it tomorrow. We finished early. It would be nice to have it tomorrow." Whereas the client may need 2 weeks to get approval for it, for instance. The point is, if it's not within your accepted program, you cannot. The contractor cannot say also request access unless it's within the accepted program. So if a contractor submits a compensation event for not getting access and it wasn't in the accepted program, that is not valid. So this is very similar to the previous one. So if the client was to provide any sort of say equipment or plant and material to do the works, that also needs to be within your accepted program as a contractor. If it isn't, the client isn't obliged to provide it when you say it is. So it's key to understand that for contractors. So this goes on the previous points. Project manager gives an instruction. This is one of the key risks for clients within the industry as a whole. This is something I deal with on a day-to-day basis, and it's critical that we understand. If a client has more than one contractor on site, and say, for instance, there's one principal contractor, but the subcontractors for the principal contractor are under the principal contractor's jurisdiction. However, if you omit a part of the scope and give it to another contractor that's not part of the principal contractor's team, that becomes a client risk, and your principal contractor will put this within your program that I need, I don't know, Bob the tree surgeon to cut these down by in 2 months' time, and if he doesn't for whatever reason, and that's a client's risk, the contractor would be entitled to a compensation event there. So this is a key to understand. When I'm assessing programs, for those that were here in the last session when he talked about programs, we spoke about how it will eventually link to compensation events. When a contractor submits a program, the first thing I look for are client obligations and how others, NEC likes to call others, anything that's not the main contractor or the client or the project manager, are defined as others. So I would look for how they are to what jurisdictions or obligations that others have, which is a client risk under this compensation event. NEC, we covered this previously. There's no scope to remain silent in NEC contracts because there's timescales for everything. And if you do not reply within the period required by the contract, that is a compensation event. So, a common situation that comes up, the project manager goes on holiday for 2 weeks. He's been working hard for 10 months of the year. It's a well-deserved break. But what often gets forgotten, if he's going on a holiday, he's going to respond to the communications. It's unfair to ask the project manager while he's on a beach somewhere to check his emails and reply to an early warning. So what many people forget is to delegate responsibility, and within an NEC contract you can do that. So that's another key example of how you can be proactive there. But the key is if the project manager was on holiday, there's no one delegated, no one replies, um, that is a compensation event. This one's quite simple. If the contract is quite digging, he comes across 100 tons of gold, for instance. So it belongs to the client, but the project manager needs to give an instruction on how to deal with it. The idea being is that the contractor gets compensated on its dealing with the object of value, but the object of value doesn't belong to the contractor because it's the client's site within the site boundary. So this is another one of my favorite ones. So the project manager or supervisor changes a decision which he has previously communicated to the contractor. For instance, project manager issues an instruction to change the scope. Then he says, "Oh, okay. I no longer. I told you instead of red doors, I wanted blue doors. Now I've decided I don't want doors at all." That's another compensation event. So you can see how all of these links, and if you're not careful, it can really increase your budget. So this one specifically relates to programs. For anyone who was there on our last session on programs, they will remember that the contractor, sorry, the project manager cannot reject a program if for any reason other than what's stated. So if, for instance, the project manager doesn't like the contractor's planned completion, if it's for 5 months late, or he cannot reject a program because of that. Because as this clause states, that is a compensation event. This one is always one of my favorite ones. So the supervisor cannot go to the contractor and say, "Oh, okay, I think there might be a defect there." So if the supervisor will instruct the contractor to search for a defect to prove that it is, and if it isn't found, the contractor gets a compensation rent. The idea being it gets reimbursed for the time and any knock-on impacts it has. This is to discourage the supervisors from causing unnecessary delays. Speaking about delays, that's also another compensation event. So you can see how all of these link together. This is another one of my favorite ones. Physical conditions encountered within the site. Say if you find rock 2 meters below, that's a client risk. If that's not within your site information, the contractor gets a compensation event, but there are 4 caveats to that. If an experienced contractor could have judged that there could have been hard rock or concrete below 2 meters, for instance, that won't be a compensation event, because say if it was previously a landfill site and there's a lot of made ground and there's a lot of former construction works within the site itself, it would have been reasonable to assume that an experienced contractor could have judged for there to be concrete below, and he should have satisfied himself to its requirement. So that could have been an example of physical conditions being found but not getting a compensation event. The last paragraph said that's over there. Only the differences between the physical conditions encountered and those for which it would have been reasonable to allow for is taken into consideration. So what that tells us is that only the difference in cost would be accounted for. You cannot claim for 150 people of your team being stopped to do any works and 15 excavators stopped and your program is delayed by 3 years. So it's only the difference. That's quite key, and sometimes I have to find myself repeating that to contractors. I'm conscious I have been talking for a while. Are there any questions so far while I sip on some water? Perfect. No questions. Let's move on. So a weather measurement is this is quite interesting. I'll give you an example. I recently joined a site where there was a compensation event for weather, and anyone who's worked with NEC contracts knows that this is extremely difficult to get a compensation event on this. So I questioned why was it given, and the client at the time didn't quite understand the caveats to this. As we look at, if the client contractor wants a compensation event for exceptional weather, NEC gives us a very robust definition. So a weather measurement is recorded within a calendar month. Your contract data will show you where the weather measurement is recorded. A lot of the times it's with the Met Office, so it's worth looking at what apparatus you're using to record weather. So what it needs to show is that by comparison, your Met Office, for instance, will show you 10 years worth of weather measurements, is that it needs to occur on average less frequently than once in 10 years. So if you get extreme rainfall, unless it causes a flood, it's probably not a once in a 10-year event. So this is a very difficult compensation event to get. Contractors will know that once in 10 years events are becoming quite common, so they do price in for this risk. Another caveat to this is that if you're using the Met Office, it typically goes from 2010 to 2020. So all of your extremely from 2020 to 2025, for instance, those extremely hot summer days or extreme weather we've had, is that the weather isn't still accounted for within that data, so you still cannot prove it unless you're using the latest data, for instance. So that's another one to look into, but let's not go into that much detail. I do apologize about the lengthy slide, but I will summarize it for you in a few sentences. So 60.114, if it shows it's a client liabilities are further defined in 80.1. And those will also be a compensation event that can include anything that can be seen as a client's fault other than site access, such as clients not providing what they are going to, client causing unnecessary delays, client damaging the contract's works, for instance. So that's a brief summary of what that can entail. We don't have time to go through every single one of them, but I will share the slides, but feel free to reach out separately if you do have any questions on those. This is another one of my favorite ones. I'll give you an example that's happened very recently. The contractor was delayed by 7 months, and the client had to take over the site because part of the site was completed. So they decided, okay, we're going to take over. It's costing us more to not take over the site. So the contractor claims a compensation event for part of the before 60.115. The project manager certifies takeover of part of the works before both completion and the completion date. Without getting too technical, what is the problem with that statement of what I just mentioned? Anyone want to have a go?
Could you please repeat it?
Yeah, so I'll give you a scenario. The contractor is delayed on a project by 6 months. The client needs to take over the site. It's costing them a lot of money for not taking over the site. It's the contractor's fault for not taking over for being delayed. So the client takes over part of the site, they use half of it, and the contractor gets annoyed and they say, this is a compensation event, we want money for this. Bear in mind the contract is 6 months late at this point. They said you've taken over a part of the site. So in 60.115, we want a compensation event. I'll try to narrow it down. Why is this not a compensation event?
Because it was the contractor's responsibility to hand over the site on time.
Correct. But there's also one more reason, and it's written on the screen. I'll give you guys the answer. So if you read it, the project manager to the NEC is very specific about its wording, and it's important not to assume anything unless you can read it right in front of you, and you have to read it carefully. The project manager certifies takeover of a part of the works before both completion and the completion date. I appreciate that there's needs a little bit more understanding to appreciate the nuances, but completion is defined as you've completed all of the works and that the works information requires you to, and there aren't any defects stopping you from doing it. So they've taken over. They haven't compared the site completion hasn't been achieved, but they have taken over after the completion date because the completion date was 6 months after. So it meets the requirement for completion date, but not completion. So all of the works have not been completed. So therefore, they haven't taken over before both completion and the completion date. They've only taken over after the completion date. So therefore, it is not a compensation event. And so, yeah, I find that quite interesting. It's something I've had very in-depth discussions with contractors about. So, yeah, that's the one to quite to understand and appreciate. I think that one's quite self-explanatory. Client needs to provide materials or whenever it is said as the works information states. If the client is negligent in their duties, the contractor gets a compensation event. This one's one of my favorite ones. When a contractor submits a quotation, the project manager can state assumptions. So if an event is too uncertain to be forecast reasonably and the client doesn't want the contractor to put in £1 million worth of risk and contingencies, for instance, the contractor thinks, okay, you want me to add another extension to my building, and okay, I think there's going to be rock there, so I'm going to put in £1 million of risk for rock. The project manager goes, whoa, what the hell, that's not correct. I've had site information done, I know that there's no rock there, so I don't want to pay that £1 million extra, so I'm going to give you an assumption to state that in your part of your price return assume that there's no rock. So the contractor removes the £1 million worth of risk. Project manager gives an assumption that there's no rock, and if, for instance, now the contractor goes to do the work and they do find rock, even though the project manager has stated an assumption that there is no rock, the contractor then gets a compensation event. This can work well if you're confident about your assumptions and if you don't want the contractor to price in unnecessary risk, for instance. I've used this quite well, and I've also used it not so well. So it's important to understand. So this one's quite interesting. A breach of contract, for instance, if the client doesn't do anything that it was supposed to. So NEC places an equal amount of risk allocation by default on contractors and clients. This is, for those that are familiar with other contracts, this would be a force majeure event where there could be a natural disaster or something. NEC just uses different language and it doesn't attempt to define it further. So a tsunami goes and destroys your site, and it can be defined as stops the contractor completing the whole of the works, for instance, and which neither party could prevent. It's safe to say that a client or contractor could not prevent a tsunami, for instance. It's very difficult to get a compensation event for this unless there's a clear example, but I've seen contractors try nonetheless, so all these conditions need to be met. This is another one of my favorites. For those that are familiar with NEC 3 contracts, not NEC 4, this is a change to NEC 4. The client can give a bunch of proposed instructions. Different is, say, the contractor, going back to my door analogy, my scope said red doors, I think blue doors might look better. I don't want you to do it just yet. I want to know what it's going to cost me. So I'm going to give you a proposed instruction before you implement it. I want to know the price. So what happened in NEC3 is a lot of a lot of clients issued a lot of proposed instructions left, right, center, and this would take up a lot of the contractor's resources, time, money, and resource for the quantity surveyors to prepare these quotations without getting reimbursed for it. For the project manager to turn around and just say, oh, okay, I don't want to do that. Good change in NEC4 is that this proposed instructions, if it's not implemented, the contractor gets a compensation event, being that they would get reimbursed for the quantity surveyors' time to prepare the quotation. Now clients have to be a lot more careful and put in genuine requests without overloading the contractor, because knowing that if they don't accept it later, the contractor is going to get reimbursed for their time. There can also be additional compensation events listed in your contract data. So it's important to read your contract very thoroughly. So now that we know what compensation events are, we need to understand the process. So with what NEC guides us to, there's 3 steps: a notification, quotation, and implementation. Either party can notify it, the project manager or the contractor. And once it has been notified, granted that it's a valid compensation event, the contractor is then invited to submit a quotation. Remember, a quotation consists of your time impact and your cost impact. You cannot choose either or. It could be, but it could be that there's a cost impact or a no time impact, or a time impact and no cost impact, but NEC gives you the opportunity to assess both. The client cannot say, I don't think there'll be a time impact. It's up to the contractor to prove it. Once that's done, the quotation comes in, the project manager will assess it, and then we'll implement it. And that's when your prices, completion dates, or key dates are changed. So the project manager or the contractor can implement it. It's important for the contractor to notify the project manager as soon as they become aware of an event. NEC typically has timescales for this. The standard wording is 8 weeks of becoming aware of the event. I've seen a lot of disputes over this. I've been involved in many disputes over this. Clients will often say, you've been time barred, you're too late, you cannot do it. The idea of this being to put a time restriction on it is that what would happen in a lot of contracts in the past is that once the job is done, there were nasty clients or nasty contractors, vice versa. Once the job is done, 6 months later, they'll look for more compensation events to claim. So this puts a time bar on it. If it's not done within 8 weeks, you do not get a compensation event. It is considered invalid. Mohammed, you got your hand up.
So just a quick question. The project manager we are referring is to the one we are mentioning about the client's project manager, isn't it?
That's correct, yeah. So it's a very good question. NEC has defined roles and responsibilities. There's a client, there's the project manager, and the supervisor. The project manager and the supervisor are working on behalf of the client. In the contractor's project manager, for instance, the contractor is defined as plural in the contract. So anyone who's working for the contractor is just defined as the contractor. So the contractor's project manager is just the contractor, for instance, but the contractor's team may consist of many people. So I've always found this interesting. I think there's this could be defined further in NEC contracts, because in team, it's in projects you're working on, you can get notifications from the contractor from 15-20 different people, because the contractor is plural, it's more than one entity, which I can find quite frustrating at times, but maybe that there is chance room for improvement there. What's the key for this clause is that if you read the bottom, is becoming aware of the event. So it's not when the event happened, it's becoming aware of it, and there is case law to prove it as well. So if something happens and you can prove you wasn't aware of it, say until 2 weeks later, which will be difficult to prove. So you cannot argue that your 8 week starts from the 2 weeks after the event because you wasn't aware of it until then. This highlights the importance of robust and accurate record keeping. So here's a question. What do you think might happen if the contractor misses this crucial 8 week deadline for notification? The floor is open to everyone. Anyone want to have a go? No right or wrong answers there.
It should not be considered as a compensation event.
Correct. That is what we've just gone on. So that is the correct answer. But of course, things are never ever that simple. There is a caveat to that. There's a caveat to that, and if in the contract clause, if the project manager if the project manager was supposed to issue a compensation event and they didn't, it was the project manager's responsibility, then the 8 week doesn't apply. So I've explained this to clients numerous times. You cannot just say it's time barred. If the project manager gives an instruction to change the scope, the contract then requires you to issue a compensation event at the same time. And project managers do not do that. If it is, then you know what happens then? Then the contractor has until the defect state to submit it. This could be 1 year after the project. So that would be when the 8 week time deadline doesn't apply. Probably too much detail for this session, but I always find these quite interesting, and it's always interesting talking to contractors about it and listening to the different perspectives. So anyways, your first step is to submit a notification. The project manager includes in the notification to submit a quotation unless the event arises from a fault of the contractor. This is very contentious. So I've seen this being very argumentative. So if the project manager has to give an instruction because it's a fault of the contractor, for instance, the contract is so delayed, the project manager needs you to expend more resources to get it done quicker or to meet up the time. The project manager will give an instruction, but he may say it's not a compensation event because the first bullet part says from a fault of the contractor. If the contract is delayed, I think it's pretty safe to say that's a fault of the contractor. So that may not be a compensation event. This will always be contentious, so make sure before you say that the contractor is not entitled to a compensation event that you are very confident and you can back your case on this. This second bullet point is also contentious. If the project manager thinks that it has no effect on defined cost completion or meeting a key date, then the project manager can say, I don't want you to give me a quotation. There has no impact on anything. Contractor will most likely beg to differ on that, so just to embrace yourself before that. NEC is all about being collaborative, so have that conversation before, make sure there's a mutual agreement, and don't just dictate laws and enforce the contract blindly. So once a compensation event has been notified, the contractor can submit a quotation. This will include your time impact, price impact, and changes to completion date or any delays. So as I mentioned earlier, NEC has timescales for everything. The project manager needs to notify and instruct contractor to submit quotations. This is a very interesting clause. If you look at the second bullet point, if the contractor notifies a compensation event and the project manager doesn't respond, he has a week to respond to the compensation event. So if the project manager then doesn't respond, the contractor may remind them. If the contractor reminds the project manager, Mr. Project Manager, I gave you a compensation event notification, you haven't responded. what the clause says there is that if you still don't respond, it could be deemed accepted. So project manager, if they don't want a DBS compensation when accepted, you have to respond. Say the project manager does respond, he has 2 weeks to reply. If he doesn't agree with the quotation, he will instruct them to submit a revised quotation. He may say that I love your quotation, I agree, it's accepted. Or he says, you know what, you misunderstood the requirements, I'm going to do my own assessment. This is very contentious. If the project manager does his own assessment, but he has the ability to do so, the project manager will most likely assess it a lot less than what the contractor would, but the project manager has the authority to do that. So I always say to contractors and clients, rather than enforcing this, have a chat about it, make sure your requirements are understood and have it implemented. Be collaborative. Otherwise, you risk adjudication. However, if the project manager does do his own assessment, that is implemented as final unless the contractor enforces adjudication, and no one wants to go to court over it. So work together. Here's a Mohammed. You got a question?
Yeah, it's a quick one. We have the time frames, isn't it? So this contractor issues a compensation even, and the project manager doesn't agree, and he comes with a different quote, and then the contractor doesn't agree. Like, is it like if as soon as the project manager doesn't agree, does it go straight to adjudication, or is there a cycle or a loop there?
A very, very good question. So let's go back to our last slide. So if the project manager contractor submits a quotation, project manager doesn't agree, he may instruct the contractor to submit a revised quotation saying saying that you priced in for this, this, and this. I don't disagree with it. I'm instructing you to submit a revised quotation. So bear in mind, this step is optional. I encourage the project manager to be collaborative and do this. But if the project manager doesn't want to do it, he can do his own assessment. So this will be very contentious, as we all know, and so it's important to get this right. So it's important to communicate with the contractor, have an informal meeting. This is all you haven't understood my requirements. You priced in a lot more than I would have liked. I don't want you to price in for this, this, and this. Then they may instruct you to submit a revised quotation. If the project manager wants to say, you know what, I've had enough of you, I'm going to do my own assessment, that is final. So the project manager doesn't need to instruct to do a revised quotation, is the key distinction. So, but bearing in mind, if the project manager assesses it for 10 grand, whereas it's probably closer to 150, then you're probably risking adjudication in that case. So it's just important to keep that in mind. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, yes, it is. Thank you.
Perfect. Let's move on. So how are conflicting timescales handled when the period for reply differs from other contractual deadlines? For those that are familiar with the NEC contracts, there's timescales for everything. People assume that the period for reply applies to everything. Incorrect. If the contract says the contractor has 3 weeks to reply to submit a quotation and the period for reply is 2 weeks, the contractor has 3 weeks, for instance. The period for reply only applies when there's no other deadline timeline stated. It's important to understand these differences because, as we covered earlier, this can be a compensation event. So we've covered how to assess the cost, and now let's look at the time. For those that were there in our last session, I'll summarize this slide. If there's no float within your program and it delays planned completion, then and it is a compensation event, your completion date gets moved as well. This is always an interesting one, and I have found myself explaining this to every single contractor. Contractors may submit a pretended percentage risk or inflation or contingency in the compensation event. But as 63.8 states, unless it has a significant chance of occurring, you cannot price in for risk within your compensation events. So we can all see how important this is. I've had to argue this with every single contractor I've been involved with, but the wording is very clear. If you cannot demonstrate that it's a significant risk, if you just put in a percentage allowance, that doesn't sound pretty significant to me. However, if you define it further, say that if you can prove that is a significant and there's a high likelihood of it occurring, I cannot reject it based on that clause. And what 66.3 says, once a compensation event is implemented, it is not revisited later. So how the NEC does it differently is that your compensation event is based on your actual defined cost plus forecast defined cost. So not all of your costs are going to be accurate. There is an element of forecasting involved. If for instance 6 months down the line the client realizes, oh, okay, we've overpaid by 50 grand, you cannot go back and reopen it because it's proven to be less costs. Once it's implemented, it is not revisited. And again, as we saw earlier, if the project manager changes a previously communicated decision, that's another compensation event. So you can see how these all interlink. I won't go into too much detail. All we need to know is plan completion and completion date to the right. If a compensation event delays your plan completion, completion date moves as well. So the prices are assessed as your actual defined cost plus forecast defined cost. So be your actual, say you get a burst water main, for instance, it's a compensation when client risk clearly. You would expect the contractor to react competently and promptly to it. So your actual defined cost may be to stop the leak, get sandbags, stop the spread of the water leak, for instance. And your forecast defined cost could be to repair it permanently, removing the sandbags, for instance, whereas it hasn't been done yet. Plus the fee on top. What people don't understand is that compensation events aren't for profit. You're not supposed to price in for profit within your defined cost. Defined cost is meant to be within your open market and competitively tendered prices. The fee, which we won't go into too much detail today, that's your tendered fee percentage, and that's what your profit margin is. If your fee percentage is 15, fee 15% gets applied to your defined cost, and that's should be your profit margin in theory. So if you see contractors pricing in for £500,000 worth of risk and a profit allowance in there, that's wrong. Your fee is supposed to cover all of it. The next sentence, 63.2, may agree, project manager or contractor may agree rates and lump sums to assess the changes to their prices. Completely optional, don't have to do it, but we're going to cover this more in the next session. So as we've covered, project compensation events are not revisited. Unless it has a significant risk, the contractor cannot price for it. The project manager can state assumptions. If, for instance, it's the concrete example I gave, the contractor prices in for concrete, project manager doesn't think there's going to be concrete. The project manager saves on a lot of risk for the concrete price. And however, if concrete is found later on, the project manager has to correct the assumption, which will give the contractor the risk allowance for that. The project manager has flexibility, as we covered earlier as well. We can ask for revised quotations, we can state assumptions, we can do a proposed instruction where it's not to be implemented, where it's price only, and at that stage. As we covered as well, there are sanctions for not responding. If the contractor doesn't submit a compensation within 8 weeks, you're not entitled to it unless the project manager should have notified it. And on the project manager, if the contractor notifies the compensation and the project manager doesn't respond, the project manager may remind the contractor may remind the project manager of a compensation. If he still hasn't accepted or responded to it, that's a compensation event. So proactive communication is critical to success of any NEC project. What can happen is that the project manager is on holiday, you get a DBS contractor, and he submits a compensation amount which is completely ridiculous. If you're following the contract word for word, and the project manager doesn't respond after the contractor's reminder, that is a compensation event. So it's important to delegate authority in that situations. We covered the cost of preparing quotations. They're defined differently within NEC3 and NEC4. In NEC3, if you ask for a quote only and it's not implemented, you don't get reimbursed. In NEC4, you do. So the key takeaway here is that active management is needed, an agreed format for quotations, work with each other, not against each other, and you need good negotiation skills to work with the contractor for acceptable quotations. And if you don't want unnecessary risk, give project manager assumptions, use it strategically. This part is key. This is my personal framework for what I use to assess valid compensation events. I've got a 5-point test method that I use, and this will show you on how compensation events, how I deal with them directly. If you cannot link it to any of the clauses we stated, then it's not a compensation event. For anyone working with NEC contracts, I encourage you to take a screenshot of this slide because this will save you or your client or your contractor a lot of time and hassle. So to assess the validity of a compensation event, if it's valid, we're going to go through this 5-point test. Does the event arise from a fault of the contractor? If it's no, we can move to the next one. Has it happened or is expected to happen? Yes. Has it been notified within the 8 weeks? Yes. Does the event affect defined cost completion, or meeting a key date? Yes. And is it one of the compensation events stated in this contract? For a compensation event for a contractor to be valid, all of these conditions need to be met exactly within this order listed here. If it isn't, it is not a compensation event. And if you need more information on that, refer to clause 61.4. I use this every time. However, compensation events project notified by the project manager, this only applies to compensation events notified by the contractor. If it's notified by the project manager, they do not go through this test because it's assumed that the project manager would have understood this already and assessed it to be valid before a project manager notifies a compensation event. Once all of that is done, the compensation event is implemented. And as you discussed, once it's implemented, it is not revisited again. That is the end of the story, unless a assumption is to be corrected. That is the only exception to that. The key takeaways are compensation events are arguably the most important thing in the contract, and that active management is needed. Either party can notify a compensation event, and the 3 steps are notification, quotation, and implementation. If you are interested in more, I've written more articles on this, which you can revisit. I'll share the slides and you can read up about it. And if you liked what you saw, please get in touch. We've got a website which I'm formed. It's a small business, so any support would be appreciated. We post quite a lot on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok. We do short form videos as well. And if you've got any questions, please just reach out to us. Other than that, I'll now take any questions if there are any. Mohammed.
Hi. Are all compensation events preceded by early warnings?
Not all of them, but it's a very, very good question and something that we haven't covered today. There's a clause that says if an early warning wasn't issued, for instance, that should have been issued, the project manager can assess it as if they had. I'll give a common example which happens all the time. A contractor is working on site and and the client was to provide power to the site. The contractor has no power, they start panicking, they order in 15 generators to power the temporary works, for instance. The contractor then submits a quotation because you said you're going to give us power, you didn't. And then when the project manager looks at it, he said, whoa, you should have told me that you needed power, you should have given me an early warning. And because if I had this early warning, I would have told you that there's alternative power available for 20 meters to the side of the building. So you could in that case you would have needed to order all those temporary power generators. Now because you didn't give me an early warning, I'm going to assess it as if you had. So I'm going to assess it as if you gave me an early warning, and I would have just told you to give to direct me towards the alternative power. So that's a key. That's an important sanction on the contractor to submit early warnings on that. So it's a great question.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Raja, are there any closing thoughts from yourself? I think it's been quite good today.
It's brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Waleed. The only thing that I like to say is that with the NEC contracts, a lot of it is behavior driven. So there is a lot of onus on working together, working collaboratively, but obviously in line with the contract. So things like, the example you've just given around compensation events and early warnings, in an ideal world, and such scenarios do exist in construction as well, people do talk to each other, and if the contractor is just picking up the phone to the client or to the employer, depending on, or to the ECCPM, depending on whether you're following NEC 3 or NEC 4, you can get to the bottom of those early warning / compensation events pretty quickly, and it just the way the NEC works is that it doesn't let issues fester till the end of the project before they become real issues. Nothing more from myself. Thank you so much, Waleed, for your time. As always, we have recorded this session and we'll be sharing this session now that I've found a way to do it. But Jazakallah khair, everyone, for your attendance, and we will join you with the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.